Rosalind Vane stepped off the Cheyenne train with a single carpet bag, a crooked front tooth she had stopped bothering to hide behind her hand years earlier, and a short rehearsed speech she delivered to Garrett Holt before he had so much as offered his name, before the porter had even set her trunk down on the platform boards. "I have no dowry, no beauty the papers would admit to, and no patience for liars," she said, watching his face for the flinch she had learned to expect from men meeting her for the first time, the particular small recalibration she had watched cross a dozen faces before this one. "I thought you should hear the whole accounting before you decide whether this arrangement is worth the train fare you spent bringing me here." Garrett Holt, a rancher of 38 with a limp from a mining accident he rarely mentioned, and considerably less land than his letters had perhaps implied, looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that Rosalind began composing, in her head, the polite excuse she expected him to offer, and said instead, "Then we already have something in common, Miss Vane. I have no fortune worth marrying for, a leg that fails me in wet weather, and a temper I have spent 10 years working to keep in check after it cost me the one engagement I had before this. I did not bring you 2,000 miles to be disappointed by an honest accounting. I brought you here because your letters were the first ones that did not pretend to be something they were not." Rosalind had prepared herself for many possible responses to her opening declaration. The polite withdrawal, the awkward silence, the sudden interest in the return train schedule that she had witnessed at least twice before. She had not prepared herself for a matching one, offered just as plainly and without a single flinch, and she found herself standing on the Cheyenne platform with her carpet bag still in hand and the porter waiting patiently with her trunk, entirely uncertain what to say to a man who had just answered her deficits with a list of his own instead of simply absorbing hers and deciding what to do with the information. Neither of them yet understood that this exchange of honest shortcomings, delivered like two merchants comparing damaged goods before agreeing to a fair trade, was about to become the most solid foundation either of them had ever built a relationship upon, considerably sturdier than any foundation either of their previous, more conventional courtships had ever managed to provide. Rosalind Vane had learned to catalogue her own deficiencies at 17, the year her engagement to a Kansas City banker's son collapsed within a month of his mother's first proper look at her, a look that traveled from Rosalind's crooked tooth to her modest dress to the absence of any family fortune behind her, and settled, finally, into a verdict that required no words to deliver. The engagement ended within the week, delivered by a curt note rather than any direct conversation, and Rosalind, humiliated and furious in roughly equal measure, made herself a private promise standing in her father's parlor, the note still crumpled in her fist, that no man would ever again discover her shortcomings as though they were a secret she had failed to disclose. She would list them herself, first, plainly, and let any man who wanted to leave do so before either of them had wasted real feeling on the arrangement. She had carried that promise through 4 subsequent courtships, each one ending the moment she delivered her honest accounting, a pattern that had taught her, more thoroughly each time, that most men wanted the fantasy of a wife rather than the plain fact of one, and that her own directness, however protective, seemed to guarantee exactly the rejection she was trying to control the timing of. By the 4th failed engagement, she had begun to wonder whether her strategy was in fact a shield at all, or simply a slower, more dignified way of arriving at the same lonely conclusion every time. Garrett Holt's own habit of leading with his flaws came from a considerably harder lesson, forged in the mining accident that had crushed his leg at 26 and the engagement that had quietly dissolved in the 2 years of recovery that followed. His intended, a merchant's daughter named Beatrice, had waited through the first difficult months with visible strain, and had finally admitted, with more honesty than kindness, that she had pictured a different kind of husband than a man who would always walk with a cane and sometimes could not work a full day when the weather turned. Garrett had not argued the point. He had simply understood, watching Beatrice's relief at the engagement's end outweigh any grief she showed, that his leg had become the whole of what she saw when she looked at him, and he had resolved never again to let a woman discover that particular disappointment gradually, when he could simply state the plain fact of his limitations from the very first meeting instead, sparing them both the slow, mounting dread of a truth deferred. Here is the compatibility neither of them could see on the platform. Rosalind Vane had spent years testing men with her own honest deficits, watching each one leave, and slowly concluding that no man would ever answer her honesty with his own. Garrett Holt had spent years offering that exact honesty first, and watching each woman treat it as a warning rather than an invitation. They had each, independently, perfected half of the exchange that finally worked between them in a single minute on a train platform, one offering the confession, the other answering it in kind. For the first time, either of them had ever actually completed the trade, rather than simply watching the other party walk away mid-transaction. The ride out to Garrett's ranch gave both of them considerably more time to continue the accounting they had begun on the platform, and what started as a wary trade of admitted flaws slowly widened, mile by mile, into something closer to an actual conversation, the wagon wheels creaking beneath them, and the Wyoming plains stretching flat and gold in every direction, the kind of landscape that seemed to invite honesty simply by offering nowhere convenient to hide. Rosalind told him, encouraged by his own frankness, about the crooked tooth itself, the result of a childhood fall from a hayloft that her mother had never had the money to have properly set, and how she had spent years training herself not to smile too widely in company, a habit so old it had become nearly unconscious, something she only noticed now, saying it aloud, because Garrett was watching her mouth with plain curiosity, rather than the polite, careful avoidance most people managed. Garrett told her, in turn, about the specific mine collapse that had crushed his leg, the timber that had given way without warning on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the two friends who had not walked out of that shaft at all, and the particular guilt of surviving with only a permanent limp when better men beside him had not survived at all, a guilt he said he had never spoken aloud to anyone, not his own family, not Beatrice. Rosalind said, "I do not believe you have ever told a prospective bride that story before today, Mr. Holt." Garrett said, "I have not. I have told women about the leg. I have never told anyone about Amos and little Ted, not since the funeral. I find I do not entirely know why I am telling you now, except that you seem like the kind of person who would rather hear the whole of a thing than the polished version." Rosalind said, "I am exactly that kind of person, Mr. Holt, though I confess it has cost me 4 broken engagements to learn that most people prefer the polished version regardless of what they claim to want. My own mother used to tell me that a woman ought to let a man discover her faults slowly, the way you let bathwater cool before stepping in. I found I could never manage the patience for it. I would rather know immediately whether a man could bear the whole of me than spend months easing him toward a truth he might reject regardless." They continued in this fashion for the length of the ride, each admission answered by another. Rosalind's temper, quick and sharp when provoked, matched against Garrett's own hard-won patience with it. Garrett's occasional dark moods after a difficult day, answered by Rosalind's plain refusal to either coddle or flee from them. She told him about the year she had spent, after her 3rd broken engagement, refusing to leave her father's house at all, certain that the accounting she insisted on delivering had simply doomed her to a life alone, and how the 4th engagement's collapse had nearly convinced her to stop trying entirely before her father, in his own quiet way, had encouraged her to answer just one more matrimonial advertisement, the one that had eventually reached Garrett's letters. By the time the wagon reached the ranch house, both of them had told the other considerably more honest, unflattering truth than either had shared with any previous prospective spouse, and both of them found, somewhat to their own surprise, that the accumulated honesty had produced not disappointment, but a kind of cautious, growing relief, the specific lightness of a burden set down after being carried, unshared, for a very long time. Garrett said, helping her down from the wagon, "I confess I do not know what to do with a courtship that has not yet produced a single flattering compliment, Miss Vane. I am not certain either of us has said anything nice about the other at all today." Rosalind said, "I would rather have an honest accounting than a flattering one, Mr. Holt. I have had considerably more experience with flattery, and it has served me a great deal worse than this conversation has." Garrett laughed, an unguarded sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, and said, "Then let me offer one honest observation, instead of a compliment. I find I am in no hurry at all for this conversation to end, which is not a sentence I expected to say to anyone again after Beatrice." Rosalind said, quietly, that she found herself in much the same unexpected position, and neither of them said anything further about it as they carried her single carpet bag toward the house, though both of them understood, without needing the words, that something considerably more promising than a practical arrangement had just begun between them. They married within the month, a practical arrangement that neither of them dressed up with more romantic language than either had used on the platform, and the early months of the marriage became, in their own way, a continuing test of whether the honest accounting they had exchanged would hold up against the actual friction of daily life, which is always considerably less forgiving than the friction of a single afternoon's conversation on a wagon ride. Rosalind's temper, which she had warned him about plainly, surfaced within the first 2 weeks over a disagreement about the household accounts. A sharp exchange that ended with Rosalind slamming a ledger shut hard enough to startle the barn cats and send a stack of unpaid bills sliding off the kitchen table entirely. She braced, afterward, for the reaction she had received from every previous suitor who witnessed her temper directly: withdrawal, coldness, a quiet reconsideration of the whole arrangement, the particular silence that had followed each of her 4 broken engagements. Garrett simply picked the ledger back up, reopened it to the disputed page, and studied the figures a long moment before saying, "You were right about the feed costs, as it happens. I misread the column. I would ask that next time you correct me with somewhat less force applied to the furniture, but I do not intend to hold the temper itself against you. You warned me of it plainly, on the platform, and I find I would rather have a wife who corrects my arithmetic sharply than one who lets me run the ranch into the ground politely." Rosalind found herself, hearing this, genuinely uncertain how to respond, having never once had a man treat her temper as a manageable trait rather than a disqualifying flaw, and she said, finally, "I expected you to be angry. Every man before you has been angry, or worse, quietly disappointed in a way that lasted considerably longer than the anger would have." Garrett said, "I expected, when I told you about Amos and little Ted, that you might treat me as fragile afterward, the way Beatrice eventually did, careful around my grief, the way she grew careful around my leg, as though both were the same kind of breakage, requiring the same kind of gentle handling. You have not done that either. I begin to think we may have actually meant the accounting we exchanged on the platform, rather than simply performing honesty until the real test arrived." His own limitations were tested in turn, that same season, when a wet spring made his leg considerably worse than usual, keeping him from the heaviest ranch work for the better part of 3 weeks, long enough that the carving and the fence repairs both fell behind schedule in ways that would have strained a lesser partnership considerably. Rosalind did not treat this as Beatrice once had, watching for signs of a husband who could never be relied upon. She simply reorganized the work herself, took on tasks Garrett could not manage during the worst of it, learning to mend fence and assist a difficult birth with her own 2 hands rather than waiting for his leg to recover, and told him plainly, when he apologized for the burden one particularly bad evening, that she had married a man with a bad leg, not a man who had promised her a leg that would never trouble either of them, and that she did not intend to hold him to a promise he had never actually made. Garrett said, watching her hang up her coat after a long day covering both their usual work, "I do not know how to properly thank a woman for not treating my own body as a betrayal of some promise I never made." Rosalind said, "You can thank me by getting well again in your own time, and not apologizing further for something neither of us can control. I did not marry a promise, Garrett. I married a man. The two are not the same thing, whatever Beatrice once believed." Beatrice herself, now married to a Cheyenne merchant, arrived at the ranch that autumn on ordinary social business entirely unrelated to Garrett. a courtesy call that nonetheless left both Garrett and Rosalind considerably more unsettled than either expected once the visit's purpose became clear. Since Beatrice's husband did business with a neighboring rancher, and the visit had simply been a matter of convenient timing rather than any deliberate intention to reopen old history. Beatrice was, by every visible measure, everything the matrimonial ledgers of the era considered desirable, handsome, well-dowered, entirely without the physical flaw or sharp temper that had once, in her own accounting, disqualified Garrett from a comfortable marriage. She arrived in a fine traveling dress, spoke with the easy, practiced charm of a woman who had never once needed to catalogue her own deficits to anyone, and greeted Garrett with a warmth that seemed, to Rosalind watching from the kitchen doorway, entirely genuine and therefore considerably harder to resent than simple coldness would have been. Rosalind watched the two of them exchange careful pleasantries over tea, Beatrice asking after Garrett's leg, with the polite concern of an old acquaintance, rather than the careful avoidance of a woman who had once fled from the subject entirely, and felt, despite every honest conversation she and Garrett had built their marriage upon, an old and unwelcome insecurity rising in her chest, the particular ache of comparing herself to a woman who had apparently suffered no cost at all, for choosing comfort over difficulty. After Beatrice departed, with promises of future visits that Rosalind privately hoped would not be kept too soon, Rosalind said, with more sharpness than she intended, "She is everything I am not, Garrett. Beautiful, comfortable, entirely without a temper that requires managing, and she seemed genuinely fond of you, still, after everything." Garrett said, setting down his own teacup deliberately, "She is also the woman who left me the moment my leg made me inconvenient, Rosalind. I do not say that to diminish her, only to remind you what her particular comfort actually cost, when it was tested by something harder than a social visit. You have held a ledger together with real feeling behind the anger, and you have covered 3 weeks of extra work when my leg failed me, without once treating it as a betrayal. I did not marry Beatrice's kind of comfort. I would not trade what we have built for it now, even if it were offered to me plainly, tonight, on better terms than I could ever offer you," Rosalind said, quieter now, the sharpness gone out of her voice entirely. "I do not think I have ever quite believed that, until you said it just now, watching her sit at our own table," Garrett said. "Then believe it plainly, the same way you have insisted on plain accounting, from the very first minute I met you. I chose the woman who corrects my arithmetic, and holds a ledger together, with real feeling behind the anger. I did not choose, and would not now choose, a woman whose comfort has never once been tested by anything harder than a polite social visit and a well-timed cup of tea." That evening, sitting by the fire after Beatrice's visit, Rosalind found herself turning over 4 broken engagements and a lifetime of leading every new acquaintance with her own catalogued flaws, understanding, for the first time with any real clarity, exactly what she had been protecting herself against for so many years, and how thoroughly that protection had also kept her from ever fully believing that anyone might accept her without the accompanying dread of eventual withdrawal. She said, "I have spent my whole life telling men my flaws first, because I could not bear to be surprised by their leaving. If I said it plainly myself, at least I controlled the moment of the rejection, rather than waiting to be surprised by it later, the way I was surprised by that banker's mother and her single, devastating look. I am only now understanding that I built the same wall against you, Garrett, that first day on the platform, and you simply walked straight through it by matching my own honesty rather than retreating from it, which was the one response I had never once accounted for in all my careful planning." Garrett said, "I built the same wall, for the same reason, after Beatrice. I imagine that is exactly why the 2 walls fit together so neatly, the day you stepped off that train. Neither of us was actually hiding anything from the other. We were both just protecting ourselves against a disappointment that, as it turns out, was never actually coming from each other at all, only from the 2 people who taught us to expect it in the first place." Rosalind reached for his hand across the small space between their chairs and said, "I do not believe I have ever fully trusted a man's acceptance of me until tonight, watching you turn down the comfortable version of a wife in favor of the difficult, honest one, in front of the very woman who once chose comfort over you. I think I needed to see you refuse Beatrice's ease directly, in front of me, before I could fully believe you meant everything you said on that platform, rather than simply performing patience the way I had once performed my own honest confessions. Garrett said, "Then I am glad she visited, strange as that is to say. I do not think either of us could have said what needed saying tonight, without her comfortable shadow standing there first, for both of us to measure ourselves against, and to find, at last, that neither of us wished to trade what we had actually built for it." The years that followed saw Rosalind and Garrett Holt build, out of their matched deficits, one of the more genuinely partnered marriages in that stretch of Wyoming Territory. Rosalind's sharp temper and sharper mind, for figures steering the ranch's accounts into a health they had never known, under Garrett's own more casual bookkeeping. Garrett's hard-won patience with difficulty steadying Rosalind through the rare occasions when her temper outran her own better judgment, and needed, afterward, someone willing to help her repair whatever the temper had broken along the way, whether that was a slammed ledger, a broken plate, or simply her own confidence in having handled a disagreement well. Neighboring ranchers who came to know them both over the following years remarked more than once on the particular ease between Garrett and Rosalind, an absence of the careful performance that characterized so many arranged marriages of the era. And one such neighbor, a widow named Adelaide First, told Rosalind directly that she had never seen a husband and wife argue so openly, and yet seem so entirely unthreatened by the arguing itself, as though the disagreements were simply one more form of the same honest accounting that had begun everything between them on a train platform years before. Rosalind stopped, within the first year, the old habit of covering her smile with her hand, having noticed that Garrett watched her crooked tooth with nothing but plain affection whenever she forgot to hide it, and eventually with something closer to open delight on the occasions she forgot entirely, and laughed without any thought of concealment at all. Garrett, in turn, stopped apologizing for his leg on the days it troubled him worst, having learned that Rosalind's response to his limitations had never once wavered from the plain, steady acceptance she had promised on the very first afternoon, whether the weather was kind to his leg or considerably less so. They spoke often, in later years, of the strange gift Beatrice's single social visit had given them. A mirror held up to exactly what each of them had once believed disqualified them from love, and exactly what they had, instead, built an entire marriage upon, a foundation neither comfort nor beauty could have provided nearly as well, tested as it eventually was by weather, by grief, by the ordinary accumulating friction of 30 years lived closely alongside another person. Garrett Holt and Rosalind Vane were married for 30 years, and their ranch, built on the accumulated honesty of 100 small confessions rather than a single grand romantic gesture, became one of the steadier and more respected operations in the county, run by two people who had each once believed their own particular deficits made them unsuitable for exactly the kind of partnership they eventually built together. Rosalind told their daughter, years later, preparing that daughter for her own first courtship, that the secret of a good marriage was not finding someone without flaws, but finding someone whose flaws happened to fit against your own the way two broken pieces of the same plate fit back together, imperfectly, but recognizably whole once joined. She said she had spent her whole youth searching for a man without deficits, certain that such a man existed somewhere, and that her own failures to find him reflected some failure in herself, and had found, instead, considerably more happiness with a man whose deficits simply matched her own, closely enough that neither of them ever again had to hide anything at all from the other, not even the smallest, most ordinary disappointments of daily life. Their daughter asked, hearing this, whether she ought to lead with her own flaws the way her mother once had, on a train platform, before any man had the chance to discover them gradually. Rosalind considered this a long moment and said that the leading itself mattered less than the honesty behind it, that a woman need not deliver her deficits as a rehearsed speech the way Rosalind once had out of old defensiveness, but that she ought never to hide the truth of herself from a man worth keeping, since any man who could not bear the plain truth early was unlikely to bear it any better after years of accumulated disappointment instead, and would only cost her more time and more grief in the discovering of it later. The philosopher and essayist Michel de Montaigne once wrote that there is no man so good that if he placed all his actions and thoughts under the scrutiny of the laws, he would not deserve hanging 10 times in his life. And Garrett Holt came to believe, in his own later years, sitting on his own porch, turning the observation over slowly, that the line captured something true about every marriage he had ever observed closely. The couples who lasted were rarely the ones without flaws. They were the ones honest enough to catalogue their own shortcomings first, and brave enough to trust that an honest match mattered considerably more than a flattering one. Garrett died in 1919, at the age of 72, his leg having troubled him every wet season for over 40 years, without once driving Rosalind from his side. And Rosalind lived 11 years beyond him, telling her grandchildren, in her final years, that she had never once regretted delivering her honest accounting on that Cheyenne platform. However many previous engagements it had cost her before it finally found the one man willing to answer it in kind, standing there with his own cane and his own quiet grief, offering back exactly the honesty she had learned, so painfully, to expect nothing but rejection for. She kept, until her own death, the small, crooked-toothed portrait Garrett had commissioned for her 50th birthday, insisting the artist paint her exactly as she was, smiling without concealment, for what she said was the first time in her adult life she had posed for a portrait, without once thinking to cover her mouth, and she hung it in the front parlor rather than any private room, where every visitor to the Holt ranch could see it plainly, exactly as Garrett had once seen the whole of her, plainly, on a train platform, and found nothing there worth turning away from. A dowry can be counted, beauty can be judged. But an honest accounting, offered freely and answered in kind, has a way of outlasting both. Tell me in the comments, do you think leading with your own flaws is the bravest way to test a new relationship, or does it simply invite the rejection you are trying to avoid? And if you want another story about two people who found their match in exactly the things they thought disqualified them, the next one is waiting for you right now.